Oh hi! You caught me sorting out my comic book messes. Speaking of huge comic book messes, why don't we check out the Brazilian exclusive Megaman comic book series? But first, I've been told I've got a quote to read.
Dear St1ka, can you say the Philips CDI is the #1 console that uses a Motorola 68000? Sincerely, your papi, CDI daddy.
No!
Comic tropes. Comic tropes.
In 1996, a Mega Man comic book series was released exclusively in Brazil titled Novas Aventuras de Mega Man, or Mega Man's New Adventures. The comic book series is officially licensed by Capcom and was a tie-in to the Ruby Spears Mega Man cartoon, and ran for 16 issues ending in 1998. To me, this is fascinating. We so often hear about Sega and Tectoy in Brazil, but we very rarely hear anything about Nintendo. And well, granted, Mega Man is by Capcom, but during this period, it was still very much associated with Nintendo. This comic book series is infamous in Brazil for several reasons which we'll get into. But right off the bat, it takes a lot of plot deviations from both the Ruby Spears cartoon and the Mega Man games. Partly because the editor-in-chief Sérgio Peixoto Silva and the head writer José Roberto Pereira both admitted to never having played the games, and what story they knew, they got secondhand from a friend. Additionally, despite only being 16 issues long, this series would have a multitude of retcons, plot holes, and continuity issues, making the story quite hard to follow. The head staff was also constantly changing artists and writers, and in fact, most artists would only last a single issue, making the entire series look pretty inconsistent. Sometimes, you'd get a pretty good rendition of Mega Man's childlike appearance, accurately mimicking his Japanese counterpart, while other times they would make him look like a full adult, while other times they would just completely drop the ball, like I don't even know what they were aiming for here. Reading every issue back to back just kept giving me visual and art style whiplash. Sometimes you'd have good proportions with detailed backgrounds and dynamic fighting poses, while other times you'd have consecutive issues whose art would look amateurish at best. This happened because, in order to keep costs down, the editor-in-chief kept asking fans to send their art, and if your art was good enough, you would be selected to draw a full issue and you would have a page dedicated to you, where you could promote yourself. The thing is, if you read these pages, it turns out that most of the people who drew these issues were kids who were in college or maybe even high school, so it's unclear how much they were paid for their work or if they were even paid at all. In fact, the more issues you read, the more it seems that people were sending their fan letters with their fan art attached, hoping that they would be chosen to draw the next comic and therefore break into the comic industry. And in fact, this comic book series hosted early work of some Brazilian artists who would later become successful in their comic book careers. We have, for example, Daniel Horn de Rosa, who would end up working for Marvel and DC on runs like X-Men Forever, Green Lantern Corps, and Legion of Superheroes. We also have Erika Wano, who went on to become a prominent comic book artist in Brazil, with series like Holy Avenger, Alice in Wonderland, and Warcraft Legends. I should also point out that José Roberto Pereira, who was the head writer during the first 5 issues, is a controversial figure in Brazil. He was often described as charismatic and was generally well liked by those around him. But he was also infamous for not paying artists or only partially paying them, as well as publishing foreign comics and magazines without having the rights to them. As you can imagine, he suffered through a ton of litigation up until his death in 2012, and in fact, many Brazilian comic book fans believe that he staged his own death to escape said litigation, a theory which still persists to this day, as no evidence has been found of his passing. And in fact, the legality of this Mega Man comic is not set in stone either. Every international source I could find would list this comic series as officially licensed by Capcom. But given this man's history, that might not actually be true. Reading the editor pages, they often mention having acquired the rights to publish this series from Capcom's Brazilian distributor at the time. They specifically mention that they would have the rights to publish 4 issues, and that depending on their commercial success, the contract could be extended to launch more stories. Because of this, we can actually split the Mega Man comic series in 3 phases. The original run consisting of issues 1 through 4, the first contract renewal, which gave them the right to publish issues 5 through 10, and the final run consisting of issues 11 through 16, before being cancelled. Now here's the thing. I have a theory. Every issue in this series would come with a set of posters for free, and for the initial 4 issues, every poster would use official Capcom art from the video games or the Ruby Spears cartoon. But starting with issue 5, every subsequent poster would use art from Sergio Peixoto's pool of artists for this comic, meaning that the art quality dropped considerably. Now, I can't say this with complete certainty, but given what I've been told by Brazilian comic book fans, I believe that this series was official during its first 4-issue run, and that from there on, they just kept publishing the series without Capcom's consent. This is actually even more compounded when you learn the story behind a new original character simply known as the Princess. This was said to be a major series villain, and the head writer had planned for her to kill off Mega Man and all of the Mega Man crew, so that they could in turn make the entire comic about her. She was introduced in a fourth wall breaking after story interview, and her arrival kept being teased as a major plot event in every subsequent issue. And the only reason why they didn't follow this through was because the editor-in-chief fired the head writer before he could get this far. I mean, it kinda defeats the point of having a Mega Man comic if you're going to kill Mega Man and all his friends by issue 5. Honestly, the story around this comic is fascinating, more so than the comic itself if you ask me. Another funny thing is that the editor-in-chief and head writer used to be friends, but eventually had a falling out and became bitter enemies, publishing competing anime magazines, which I'm told both were of dubious quality. Now, whether or not this falling out began due to or resulted in the Mega Man comic book firing is anyone's guess. Anyway, the first issue also opens up with a word from the head writer before he was fired. And reading this is giving me some serious Fonzie and Peprium flashbacks, because it honestly needs to be read to be believed. It opens up chastising Brazilian publishers for not investing enough in Brazilian artists or writers, choosing instead to giving money to gringos by publishing American comics, and boasts how this is a Brazilian comic and that you should buy it because you are Brazilian. Now, growing up in Portugal, I actually read a lot of Disney's José Carioca comics, which were written and illustrated by Brazilian artists, as well as the Monica series. So, while I'm no expert, I don't think that the Brazilian comic book industry was doing that poorly in the 90s, but if I'm wrong, do let me know in the comments. But then, he also chastises those same Brazilian artists and writers for choosing to work where the money is, and states how he does not write comics for his buddies, nor does he plagiarize Kamen Rider, which is a step at yet another Brazilian comic named Blue Fighter. Call me crazy, but for a supposed dead industry as he puts it, there sure seemed to be a lot of Brazilian comics during this time. The page also states how the comic was made as a tie-in to the Ruby Spears cartoon, but then it also states that the cartoon's plot was terrible, so they ignored it, and that video games have no stories and only exist to cause tendinitis. Okay, I'm gonna need some Brazilian Guaraná for this one. And then requests that you, the reader, send them your plot suggestions, so long as you don't ask them to make the series more like the cartoon or video games. Yeah, because who would want that, right? Finally, it ends telling you, the reader, that you should do your part and buy the comic, and tell all your friends to buy it as well. Who hurt you? Now, as I said before, by issue 5 the head writer was fired. So from that point on, these pages were written by the editor-in-chief, but I assure you, they did not get any better. The attacks on foreign and even Brazilian comics continued, and kept spreading woe over the fact that so many American and Japanese characters are taking over the minds of the Brazilian youth, and that there are no national heroes they can look up to. Look, I understand the need for local heroes, but you are literally doing a Megaman comic, and Megaman is a Japanese character. The pages also take the occasional stab at fans who kept asking to make the stories more like the games, and dares them to create something better than this comic. It also attacks the American, Japanese, and South American comic book industries, as well as the anime industry. On one issue, it even boasts how Capcom of America is interested in publishing the comics in the US, a claim which I find it really hard to believe. On issue 7, Sapo Xulé even goes so far as to dub himself the nationalist editor-in-chief. And if I'm being honest, at times these pages seem to veer pretty heavily into xenophobia, especially against the Japanese. Honestly, these pages, as well as the fan mail, make for a fascinating read, though not always for the best of reasons. And for better or worse, none of them have been translated into English. I will say that much like the story around the comic itself, I found these pages more interesting than the actual plot of the books. But now, I think we can finally look at the actual comics and their story. We open with a cover featuring Mega Man and Roll, and right off the bat, we run into a problem. And that is the nudity. For some reason, this series loved to have Roll naked any chance it could get, sometimes fetishistically so, likely as a strategy to sell more comics.
Don't come!
The issue is that Roll is supposed to be Mega Man's younger sister, and she's supposed to have the body and mind of a child, so they aged her up to avoid any controversy. Even in the issues where Mega Man is drawn in his child form, Roll still maintains her more mature design. Look, Brazil, I love you, but it's kinda weird, Brazil. That's kinda weird. The story opens up with Roll in the desert looking for Mega Man while being chased by sand troopers, whose designs look suspiciously similar to Pharaoh Man from the games. As she tries to escape, she falls through a sinkhole and finds Mega Man, who's been in suspended hibernation for 30 years. You might notice that Roll is cussing in these comics, something which this series will have quite a lot of. The sand troopers attack Roll, but she's saved by Mega Man at the last minute. Roll then fills in Mega Man and the reader that after Dr. Wily was captured, all robots were outlawed, so Dr. Light hid Mega Man and Roll for 30 years and upgraded their hardware. Meanwhile, a Japanese company developed a new line of androids named Neo Mavericks, though the comic never makes it clear how the Neo Mavericks are different from the previously outlawed models. Anyway, turns out the Mavericks were in league with Dr. Wily, and they took over the world in a murderous fashion. We also learn Dr. Light is dead, and that both Roll and Mega Man share a hatred for humanity due to outlawing robots 30 years prior. A plot point that the comic quickly drops when the writers change hands. Still, out of all the comic book inconsistencies, there is at least one bit that I liked. Apparently, Mega Man and Roll collect their power from defeating enemies and taking their parts, which actually does seem like one of the few good nods to the games. Though sadly, this too would be quickly forgotten in subsequent issues. Rock and Roll then take an airship and set off to look for the human resistance. On the next issue, their ship is shot down by Mega Man X's automated defense systems. Once X learns who they are, he joins them, telling them that X is in fact the original prototype created by Dr. Light, and that Mega Man and Roll were next generation models. A plot point which the series keeps retconning over and over, as sometimes it tells us that Roll was the first, but then it also implies that Proto Man was actually the first one. all while ignoring that in the games, X was actually Mega Man's successor, not the other way around. This comic also makes it clear that both Mega Man and X went to sleep with Roll,
Don't come!
and that Roll is actually not against the idea either.
Don't come!
Which, let me just remind you, they're all brothers. They also seemingly forget about the whole looking for the resistance thing, and instead just travel to random locations without a motive, something which even the writers admit. The comic also teases about a new character called the Princess, who, as I mentioned before, was introduced in a non-canonical fourth wall breaking interview. She briefly describes how she's evil and wants to kill our heroes, but mostly focuses on how she's getting revenge on all the foreign publications and media responsible for, in her own words, spying the Brazilian comic book industry. She is, however, officially introduced into the story in Patagonia, where a pair of communists summon her from a different dimension to spread the word of communism. Kind of odd considering the past issues imply that most humans were either dead or enslaved by Dr. Wily. But then again, the communist angle is dropped almost immediately too. The story also takes a small detour and describes how Roll used to be human once, but was kidnapped into what is implied to be sexual slavery. Apparently, Dr. Wily had an organization where they would kidnap young girls and turn them into robots for this purpose, and that Dr. Light was his assistant who opposed the idea and saved her. And although she was saved, Roll is shown to have developed PTSD due to her experiences. And while I'll admit that this is an interesting take for the character, I can't help but feel that all the cussing, sexual content, incest, mature themes, and at times gore is incredibly tone-deaf considering that Mega Man is a children's franchise. I mean, sure, most of its fanbase now is in its 20s, 30s, and even 40s. But this was not the case in 1996. Anyway, after taking a small detour to go to the races, our heroes believe that Base, called Slasher in the Brazilian original for whatever reason, is in the Patagonia base with the communists who are still trying to get the princess on their side. The communists eventually lose all patience with the princess and attack her, only to be promptly defeated, but our heroes arrive in the nick of time. They then dispatch the princess in a comedic fashion, and she's unceremoniously removed from the story altogether. As I mentioned before, the previous head writer wanted to make the princess kill all Mega Man characters and make the story about her. But because he was fired before he could achieve this, her plot arc became ultimately pointless. We also learn that one of the communists is in fact St1ka Cossack, Dr. Cossack's daughter from Mega Man 4, and it's implied that she may or may not be a Reploid herself, but this never goes anywhere. Anyway, it turns out Dr. Wily has been spying on our heroes all this time, along with a group of hooded robot masters. I find it interesting that they address Dr. Wily as if they were the ones in control, as we do see Dr. Wily often having to justify his actions to what I assume are his creations. Additionally, it turns out Dr. Wily has been manipulating our heroes all along, feeding them information on where Base might be, but in reality leading them towards anyone who Dr. Wily would view as a threat, like the princess and rogue robot masters. Basically, our heroes are looking for Base for unexplained reasons, and they were led to believe that he's with a mega corporation not under Wily's rule. So I guess not all humans were enslaved after all. I don't know, the comic isn't clear on that. Anyway, they find Base, defeat the mega corporation, though the leaders are able to escape. And it's revealed that they were responsible for kidnapping young girls 30 years ago, of which Roll was a victim. Base seems to be an ally here, but it's clear that he's hiding something, and that he is working with Proto Man and Zero, who are also spying on our heroes for unclear purposes. Eventually, Roll is examining Base, and she becomes suspicious that he's hiding something. Proto Man, seeing that she's getting too close to the truth, whatever the truth might be, pushes a button that deactivates her. Roll, Mega Man, St1ka, and the other communists are captured, as Base and X prove to be traitors, while Zero and Proto Man reveal themselves. They claim that this was a necessary move, but before they can explain, Mega Man breaks free and the two groups start fighting. Finally, Dr. Wily, who is revealed to now having become a Reploid himself, and his hooded robot masters join the battle. The robot masters are defeated almost instantly, making for a pretty weak climax to something they were setting up for 13 issues. Even Dr. Wily says that he did not expect them to be defeated so fast. Which once again makes me wonder why they seem to be the ones in charge in the first place. But it turns out that Dr. Wily has been hiding 150 robot masters from the various video games that apparently no one detected or knew about. And it's also revealed that his goal all along was to capture Roll for being the first Reploid with a soul. Oh, and there's also a human resistance that is brought up in the last 2 or 3 issues, but they're kinda pointless. Anyway, the good guys lose due to the sheer number difference. And as everyone is seemingly unconscious, Mega Man goes on a fit of rage and shoots a powerful blast at Dr. Wily, who is then saved at the last moment by aliens that came out of nowhere. And as all of this was happening, the Mega Corporation bosses perform a ritualistic sacrifice of a young girl for unknown reasons. And then the comic ends. Yes, that's it! The comic ends! There are no more issues after this! Who are the aliens? What are they? Why are there aliens? What is this mega corporation? Why are they sacrificing people? And what does any of this have to do with Mega Man? If you thought the plot was getting weird and confusing, trust me, you weren't the only one. This series has so many long setups with disappointing endings, or plot threads that are dropped or forgotten almost as quickly as they're set up. And there are so many inconsistencies and story points that are just not properly explained. They keep saying that Roll has a soul and can think for herself, but we see nothing that separates her from the rest of the cast in that regard. They all seem to think for themselves and have the same range of emotions as anyone else. She's only special because the plot says so. This comic, man, it really makes no goddamn sense. I'm not even sure who this is for. Between the constantly shifting art style, hard to follow storyline, and lack of adherence to the Mega Man lore, it seems like they just kept making stuff up as they went along. I mean, I guess on one hand, this series is worth a read merely due to how much of a mess it is. But it's not like it didn't have potential. On some issues the art was actually pretty good for the time. But for the most part, there are just so many problems here that I don't even know where to begin. I mean, at one point, between Roll, Mega Man, X, St1ka, her bodyguard, Proto Man, Bass, and Zero, there are so many characters on the main team that they barely get any time to breathe or have any sort of character development. Especially when you consider that each issue had an average of 30 pages. And that's counting the cover, editorial pages, fan mail, and posters. Often, half of each issue was dedicated to fighting, with very little room left for plot progression, character arcs, or moments where the characters are allowed to be themselves. As previously mentioned, I feel the story around the comics, as well as the fan mail and editor pages, are more interesting than the comics themselves. But if you want to check them out, you can find English translations online for free, though the editor pages and fan mail are left in their original languages. But if you're going to check them out, I recommend making sure you update your firewall first. So yes, the Novas Aventuras de Mega Man aren't really worth a read, but for better or worse, they are part of this character's history. And while it's not canon, it may or may not be official. And if nothing else, it's a fascinating window to a different take on Capcom's Blue Bomber. So I guess, at least, that's worth something. Hey everyone, thank you for watching St1ka's Retro Corner. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell and share this video, all that fun social media stuff. And you can also support me on Patreon. It may not seem like it, but even $1 is a really big help in keeping this channel going. I would also like to thank my newest Patreon supporter, Ivo Moraes. Anyway, I hope you have a great day. Bye!
Don't come!
When you think of Sega mascots, what comes to your mind? Sonic the Hedgehog probably, maybe some of you will answer Alex Kidd or Professor Soban or even Opa Opa. Although, small tidbit, Opa Opa actually got his name from a Brazilian expression of happiness. So I guess its name is technically Opa Opa! Anyway, I'm sure you've all heard about these characters by now, but there's one Sega mascot I've never seen anyone mention. One Sega mascot that, although short-lived, seems to have left quite an impact on gamers. And that mascot is this guy. Now, I'm sure most of you are wondering, who the heck is this? Well, this is Sapo Xulé. Sapo Xulé is a comic book character created by Brazilian artist Sapo Xulé. Paulo began his career during the 1960s at the age of 17. Here, he would eventually be contacted by one of the animation pioneers in Brazil, where he would go on to draw cartoons for Monica. Yes, we're talking about her again. And he also worked on, rice commercials? Yeah, sure, why not? But by the 1980s, he had established contacts with Hanna-Barbera, animating for shows like the Snorks. It was at around this time he'd launched a comic book series called Sapo Xulé, which roughly translates to Smelly Foot Frog, or Frog with Smelly Feet. Yeah, I know, it's a weird concept, but if it helps, the character is apparently based on a Brazilian children's limerick. Anyway, I have to admit, I'm not familiar with the comic books. To my knowledge, they were never sold in Portugal, and it seems even in Brazil, it only enjoyed a moderate success, because I had a hard time finding any scans of the comic book. However, it did spawn a fairly popular toy of the frog in the 1990s, where you could remove his footwear and it would actually smell like feet. Which I still don't get it. Then again, this was the 90s, and gross out humor was all the rage. So I guess that's what they were going for. This, however, was an for Tectoy, whom you may remember was the official Sega distributor in Brazil during this time. And just like how they signed Monica on board to promote their Master System, they wanted in on the Sapo Xulé action, spawning 3 games for it. All 3 of these games launched in 1995, which was pretty late into the console's life cycle. I mean, let's not forget the Master System launched in the US in 1986, and by 1995 the Sega Saturn was already out in the Western world, so the games were already 2 generations behind. Most likely, this was done because the Master System was still popular in Brazil during this time, but also because it was easier to make Master System games than when compared to Sega Saturn or even Sega Genesis games. So, with all this said, how are the games? Well, for one thing, Tectoy once again took the Monica route, meaning they chose to take existing games and change their sprites. However, whereas all the Monica games were taken from the same series, ensuring the gameplay and world rules remain consistent throughout each title, the Sapo Xulé games were taken from 3 different titles, by 3 different developers, and from 3 different genres. So yeah, don't expect any consistency here. Now, I couldn't find any official dates for which of these games came out first. But if I had to guess, I would say Sapo Xulé versus os Invasores do Brejo, or Sapo Xulé versus the Invaders of the Swamp. Mostly because it apparently came bundled with a scratch and sniff sticker that smells like, you guessed it, feet. I assume this was the first game to be released because it sort of sounds like the extra promotional effort you take when launching a new product. But I could be wrong. Anyway, this game is just a sprite-swapped version of Psycho Fox. You start out as a titular frog, but you can also play as his friends. But none of the other sprites have changed. It's a bit of a lazy change, but hey, it's Psycho Fox, so at least the game was good. Next up, we have Sapo Xulé SOS Lagoa Poluída, or Sapo Xulé SOS Polluted Lagoon. And as you can see, it's a shmup, and I do love shmups. But in fact, this game is a sprite swap of Astro Warrior, which was an early Master System game that, although a bit generic, made for a surprisingly fun title. I should also point out, Astro Warrior was basically a ripoff of Astro Force for the Famicom, an early shmup for the console, which is a really fun shmup. I used to play it all the time as a child on my Famiclone. Anyway, back to Sapo Xulé. This version seems to have had a bit more effort put into it, as this time they changed the main character's sprite as well as most of the enemies. So now, instead of fighting aliens, you're shooting down boots, half-eaten apples, and cotton swabs. In a way, it kind of reminds me of Twinbee. The blackness of space was also changed with this lime green background, which I feel does the game no favors. Oddly enough, the game is still in English, including its infamous English dialogues. However, they changed the name of the bosses and now call each level a lake, as in the English word for lake, not the Portuguese word. I don't get it. Lastly, we have Sapo Xulé, o mestre do Kung Fu, or Sapo Xulé, the Kung Fu Master. This game is a sprite-swapped version of Kung Fu Kid, a game which a lot of Master System fans swear by, but personally I never really cared for it. Anyway, in this one we're back to only having the main character being swapped, but at least it does seem like the most detailed 8-bit interpretation of the frog yet. In fact, it might be a little too detailed, as his art style completely clashes with the rest of the game and his enemies. I don't really have a lot to say about this one. I always found the original game to be average at best, but like I said, I've met a lot of Master System fans that swear by this game, so maybe I'm the one in the minority here. And that's it. This was the last video game outing for Smelly Foot Frog, or at least the last outing on a Sega console. I assume by 1995 there really wasn't that much steam left for the Master System even in Brazil, and producing Saturn or Mega Drive games was likely too expensive. The funny thing is, it seems that these 3 games are the main reason why the character is even remembered at all, even in Brazilian websites. As even in Brazilian websites, the games would always be the first search terms to crop up, followed by the toy, and lastly the comic book itself. With that said, it seems that just last month, in March of 2019, an attempt was made at resurrecting the character, with the release of a new comic book. Again, I haven't really read it, but I will say I like this new art style a little better than the original one. But that's just me. I'll admit I don't really get this character, but for a brief time he really was one of the most unique Sega Master System mascots. Clearly not as popular as Monica, but he definitely left his own unique impression. Hey everyone, thank you for watching 1.ka's Retro Corner. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment, subscribe and share this video. All that fun social media stuff. And if you want to support the channel, check out my Patreon, where you'll find all kinds of awesome rewards. Anyway, I hope you have a great day. Bye!
Hello ladies and gentlemen, Top Hat Gaming Man here, welcoming you to another video covering the somewhat quirkier side of gaming history. Sometimes I will learn obscure gaming facts here and there which lead me down rabbit holes into creating videos. However, sometimes these creative processes start completely by accident. During a recent eBay search, rather than typing in home consoles, I accidentally typed in the search term Homes Console, which made me chuckle, as Holmes is apparently gangster slang for a friend, an amusing term I used to regularly hear used by Eddie Guerrero. So, this then got me wondering if there were in fact any Holmes consoles, and sure enough, there was. I discovered the Zeebo, a system created in Brazil and created specifically for the Brazilian and Mexican markets. From there, I had a quick Google search for Zeebos, ordered one, and soon enough I had my elderly next door neighbour knocking on my door informing me that he had taken in my drug package from Mexico. Banter. This whole series of ridiculous events actually all happened, by the way, thus far making it perhaps my most favourite console procurement of all time. I love the concept of covering the Zeebo on this channel, as it's always fun to cover parts of gaming history which are specific to certain countries and regions. For example, in the past on here, we have looked at the Brazilian Master System exclusives. We have covered the Greek video game ban, and we have even looked at the Sega Saturn's surprising level of success in Portugal. Today though, to help me on my quest to talk Zeebo history, I am joined once again by a fantastically underrated YouTuber. He is the Portugueser known as 100ka, who based on his Portuguese language skills is much better equipped at unravelling the Zeebo story than I am. So, over to you, 100ka.
Ah yes, the Zeebo, the Brazilian console that nobody expected, surprising even the gamers in its own home market, which was then discontinued just as fast and abruptly. Not a whole lot is known about the Zeebo, especially if you don't speak Portuguese or don't live in Brazil or Mexico. But today, we thought it'd be a cool idea to talk about the console, learn its origins, and what became of it. Oh, also, don't expect good footage for this video. Almost every Zeebo footage I could find out there is pretty blurry. So, consider yourself warned. Zeebo is the brainchild of Tectoy's mobile division founder, Reinaldo Normand. Now, you might be familiar with the name Tectoy, as it was the official Sega distributor in Brazil, developing a few of their own games for the Mega Drive or Sega Genesis, like Duke Nukem 3D, or sprite-swapping the Wonderboy games on the Master System. The company was very popular in Brazil during the 90s, but once Sega left the hardware market, Tectoy's future became uncertain. The company couldn't survive on just toys, so it branched out into other markets, including DVD players and mobile devices. But despite that, the name Tectoy was slowly fading into obscurity. However, between 2007 and 2008, plans were made to re-enter the console market. This time with their own product, which we obviously know today as the Zeebo.
The Zeebo I received in the post came in this spiffing box, which interestingly was not mentioned in the eBay listing, so a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. Inside the box was the Zeebo console itself, which in many ways kind of resembles the Nintendo Wii, only with a curvier silver finish. There is an SD card slot and 2 USB ports located on the front of the system, and there is a third USB located on the back. The back of the system also features a micro USB slot, along with a composite video slot for high-end 2008 gaming, just like the Nintendo Wii itself. Also located in the box, along with the system wires, was this Zeebo card, along with a Zeebo branded USB keyboard, which personally I find quite aesthetically pleasing. The system also came with this controller, which is pretty comfortable in my hands to be fair. The joypad is clearly heavily inspired by the PlayStation controller and featured a D-pad on the left, 4 buttons on the right, and even 2 clicky analog sticks. The controller only features 2 shoulder buttons though, as opposed to 4, like what you got on the PlayStation. Anyway, now we have had a quick look at the exterior of the system, let's go back to 100ka for more history.
So regarding the system, Tectoy did not have the financial support or structure to develop its own hardware. So, it entered a partnership with Qualcomm, a mobile company better known today for the Snapdragon line of mobile CPUs. Back then, the company would also develop mobile components and even had a fairly popular operating system called Brew, which became Zeebo's operating system. At the time, Brew was famous for being difficult to pirate, which was seen as a major selling point for Tectoy. Not that they had a whole lot of choice though, as Qualcomm was keen on competing with Apple's recently released iPhone 1 and wanted to create an ecosystem similar to that of Apple, so in Qualcomm's eyes, Brew was mandatory. The hardware itself was based on mobile components in a time when smartphones were still in their infancy. I mean, in 2007 and 2008, most people were still using Blackberries, Nokias, and the first iPhone was seen as the next step in phone evolution. And to be fair, Zeebo's hardware was really advanced by phone standards, as Tectoy was under the impression the hardware would be capable of producing graphics similar to the PlayStation Portable. Except, it'd be a home console instead of a portable system. I should also point out that Brazil also has a high import tax, which still lasts to this day, which meant consoles were extremely expensive. Just to give you an idea, the PS4 Pro over there costs around €700 or $800. In fact, the PlayStation 2 didn't even launch in Brazil until 2009, the same year as the Zeebo launch. Yes, you heard me right. By the time the PS2 launched in Brazil, most of us were already playing on our Xbox 360s and PS3s. And the PS2 had been largely forgotten elsewhere. That's how bad the import tax is over there. Admittedly, Microsoft got around this issue by setting up factories in Brazil and assembling Xbox 360 consoles within the country, thereby avoiding the import tax. Anyway, back to the Zeebo. The console wouldn't have any physical media. Instead, you download every game off its own online service, ZeeboNet. The console's hardware was purposely kept simple and behind the times as a way to drive the costs down, as Tectoy's strategy was to target the emerging markets such as Brazil, Mexico, India, Russia, and China. And so, in 2009, with everything in place, Zeebo would finally launch in Brazil, to dismal sales. Part of the reason for this was the price, which was somewhere around the €100 or $150, which doesn't sound like much, but as it turns out, you could now buy PlayStation 2s for around that price off of parallel markets. So of course, everyone chose the PS2 instead. It also didn't help that its launch lineup was pretty weak, consisting of Need for Speed Carbon, FIFA 2009, and Brain Challenge. And in case you haven't noticed, all of these are mobile games. Yes, even the FIFA and Need for Speed ports are based off of the mobile games, not their PC or console counterparts. You see, not only was the console's hardware based on mobile architecture, it also only had 1 GB of internal flash memory. Now granted, it could be expanded through memory cards, but it was still a limiting factor. In fact, the largest Zeebo game ever made is a whopping 29 megabytes, so clearly there are some limitations here. In order to get people to use the ZeeboNet, anyone who purchased a console would also be able to download Quake 1, Quake 2, and Prey Evil completely free. I've never played the Zeebo versions of these games, but Quake 1 and 2 actually look like pretty good ports. In fact, from what I've seen, I'd wager this might have been the best console port of Quake 1 at the time. I mean, up to that point, we only had the Saturn and Nintendo 64 versions. Despite that, you might notice that no matter what we do, we only seem to be posting low quality Zeebo footage. And that's because despite being launched in 2009, it did not have HDMI. In fact, the console runs at 640 by 480, which was a pretty low resolution for the time, and didn't even come with the best cable options when plugging into your TV.
Further to this, I have attempted to capture Zeebo footage myself, but for whatever reason my capture card hates for Zeebo. I have not come across this problem with systems before, so my only inference is that I normally capture footage through a HDMI to SCART converter. All the composite systems I usually plug in run at 50Hz, whereas one would assume the Zeebo runs at 60Hz, thus meaning the SCART really does not like it. Instead, I have captured some footage the old-fashioned way, by filming the TV of all things. How very lowbrow. Yuck. At first, I must admit I was slightly terrified to plug my Zeebo in, as I have never tried plugging in consoles from this region in Europe. However, I managed to use a step-up converter to get this thing powered on. Once powered on, the Zeebo logo atop the system glows this beautiful blue hue, while simultaneously part of the front of the system also glows blue. I feel that this is a lovely touch, which deviates away somewhat from the blatantly obvious Wii design inspiration. Once powered on, I must admit, I do not understand the language displayed on the system. In fact, I am so ill-educated in this field, I could not even tell you if it's in Spanish or Portuguese. But, despite this, fortunately, this Zeebo unit does have a few games to sample on it, as I am displaying now, including Pac-Mania. So I am getting the opportunity to see what this 3G based system feels like to play, and from this brief experience it feels comfortable and responsive, so nothing to complain about really. Now, being somewhat of a Zeebo noob, I would absolutely adore it if someone could point me in the direction of a load of Zeebo ROMs and tell me how to install them on the platform, as I would love to create a video on the system's library and experience what this system has to offer in detail. So please leave your comments down below if you know anything with regards to this. Anyway, back to some history. Yeah.
The Zeebo's hardware was lagging behind not just its contemporaries like the Xbox 360 and the PS3, but even behind that of the PS2 and the PlayStation Portable. But it seems part of the reason was the Brew operating system, which reportedly consumed half the console's resources. 2 months after the Brazilian launch, it would also be launched in Mexico, to equally dismal sales. In fact, 3 months after the initial launch, the console would also see its first price drop. When you couple that with a selection of just 29 games during its first year, things were not looking great, but they were about to get much worse. In 2010, the console wouldn't receive any new games until April, where they released 7 Data East games, such as Bad Dudes and Super Burger Time. But Quake 1, Quake 2 and Need for Speed were also being removed from the store. Things were not looking good, and so Tectoy tried to shift gears. The Zeebo was already heavily inspired by the Nintendo Wii in terms of design, featuring a similar color scheme, and the controller itself resembles that of a Wii Pro controller. Which is pretty ironic considering Tectoy is still the official Sega publisher. But then, they went all out by introducing the Zeebo Boomerang. This was a motion controller which used the console's infrared capabilities, and Tectoy even started developing Zeebo exclusive motion-based games. As far as I can tell from second-hand experiences, the controller's accuracy left much to be desired, and the games weren't much better either. But once again, things didn't pick up. Later that year, the Zeebo service would also launch in China, though sadly, information on this is very scarce. As best as I can tell, rather than being a video game console over there, it was somehow related to digital television, allowing users to download apps and HD content. Which is pretty ironic considering the console itself can't output HD. Which leads me to believe the console may have just been a cable box which shared the same name and was published by the same company, Tectoy, who in the meantime had established offices in several countries under the Zeebo name. I can't really find any information on how well it did over there, but it seems safe to assume that it didn't produce the desired sales numbers either. Oh, and the Russian and Indian launches? Those never occurred, likely due to poor sales in the other regions. Towards the end of that year, Tectoy tried a last-ditch effort, this time marking the console as an educational system, bundling it with a keyboard and integrating internet and browser features as well as educational games. Unfortunately, its online capabilities were limited as it didn't have any flash support, limiting the websites it could access from a hardware standpoint. And it seems users could only access pages and websites which had partnered up with Tectoy, making its usefulness even more limited. By the end of 2010, things were looking dire, with poor sales, only 28 game launches, and even more games being removed from the store, including Prey Evil. Qualcomm wasn't happy either, as they never signed on to the video game market. Their original intention was to create an Apple-like ecosystem, meaning their vision was to have computers, laptops, phones, and MP3 players which all use the Brew operating system. And Zeebo clearly wasn't what they expected in terms of sales or even end goal. Tectoy did try to establish an internal game development studio which released a series of sports games. Once again, I've never played them, and their quality varied wildly. But it seems some of them were actually pretty good. Despite that, on the 31st of May 2011, the announcement was made that Zeebo is coming to an end, and that ZeeboNet would be shutting down in September of that same year for both Brazil and Mexico. Again, no word on the Chinese market, though it's safe to assume it closed around that same time. It's unknown how many Zeebo consoles were sold in its lifetime. Numbers seem to range between 30,000 and 160,000 units, though it's also unclear if those are just the Brazilian or worldwide numbers. If I had to guess, I'd say it sold 30,000 units in Brazil, with the rest being spread across Mexico and China, with the Chinese market possibly being the biggest seller as it served a different purpose there. Despite that, there were plans for a Zeebo 2, which would have launched in 2012 and would have used the Android operating system. Most likely, it would have been pretty similar to the Ouya, though whether or not it would have fared any better than the first Zeebo is pure speculation at this point.
Ah, excellent, St1ka. Thank you for informing me that there was a planned Zeebo 2 launch. I am sure the story of this platform will make an absolutely tantalising episode of cancelled consoles down the line on this channel. It is sad really that the Zeebo was not a little bit more successful, as all competition is good competition.
You know, this episode is a bit of a downer, but I kinda don't want this to end on a sad note. So why don't we take a look at some games for the console? During its lifetime, the console had roughly 50 games released for it, and some of them do seem pretty interesting. Though I have to admit, I've never played any of them. Action Hero 3D Wild Dog is a 2.5D beat-em-up / platformer. You can chain combos when attacking enemies and collect items. You can also pick up items which help you in your quest. As mentioned before, a bunch of Data East arcade games were brought over to the Zeebo, though whether these were ports or straight emulation is unknown. Games include Bad Dudes, Joe and Mac, Super Burger Time, and a few others. It's odd that Joe and Mac doesn't have any music though, instead we only get the sound effects.
Double Dragon is one of the few Zeebo exclusives out there, and it looks pretty damn good. This version was developed exclusive for the Zeebo, and I am not going to lie, I think it looks better than WayForward's Double Dragon Neon. I have heard the gameplay is pretty solid too, and this is a game I am keen to find a way of putting onto my Zeebo.
Crash Bandicoot Nitro Kart 3D is a mobile game which was ported to the Zeebo. I have to admit, I'm not big on kart racers, and this one looks okay, I guess. We also have Galaxy on Fire, which is a mission-based space simulator, and it looks pretty good. I totally play this. The sequel is available on Steam, so I guess there's that.
We also have INCEST, a 3D worms-inspired game, except you play as a giant mech. Not much else I can say about this, except that it would probably fare better as a regular mech game instead. As previously mentioned, Quake 1 and 2, as well as Pray Evil, were ported to the Zeebo. The Quake ports seem pretty good, and Quake 2 is even dubbed into Portuguese. Pray Evil I've never played, and what little gameplay footage I could find doesn't seem too great.
Magical Drop 3 is also on the Zeebo. If you've never played this arcade game, you should. Yeah, I know there's other better ways of playing Magical Drop 3, but I'll take any excuse I can get to name drop Magical Drop 3.
Raging Thunder 2 is another phone game for the Zeebo. It looks like a decentish arcadey racer, but it also looks like it has some pretty major frame rate issues. Rally Master Pro looks pretty good and seems to have a smoother frame rate too, probably making it the better racing game.
Resident Evil 4 is based off of the cell phone version, meaning it's a mission-based game in which you need to clear each level of all zombies. The controls seem stiff, but I'd probably play this. I'd just like to know why the zombies have blue skin.
The original Ridge Racer is on the Zeebo as well. It reminds me of the PS1 version, but running at a higher resolution. It also seems to be missing sound effects and voiceovers. Tekken 2 is also on the Zeebo, and once again it is running at a higher resolution than the PS1 version, but it's also missing all the CGI and voiceovers.
Coming to the end, we have another game worth mentioning, Zenonia, which is an action RPG which was originally an Android and iOS game. I've been told that this is often considered as one of the better games on the Zeebo.
And finally, we have Tectoy's internally developed exclusives, the Zeebo Extreme series, which were all sports games. I've heard some of these were actually pretty fun, but never having played them and not really being into sports games, there's not much I can say. If they seem fun to you, check them out, I guess.
And there you have it, the history of the often maligned, often misunderstood Zeebo. A console which nobody expected, nobody wanted, but actually ended up being a charming oddity in of itself. If you do get one of these systems, you won't be able to play any games through traditional means, as it doesn't have any physical media. Thankfully, it is possible to download ROM files and insert them onto a memory card, so you should be able to play its full library.
Whoa, wait a minute, St1ka. Are you telling me you know how to procure these Zeebo downloads? Spill the bloody beans, please, sir. A certain top-hatted gentleman wants to go on a conquest to appropriate these games for himself.
I think you should. The issue with digital-only consoles like this is that we run the risk of having some games being lost forever if copies aren't made and distributed online. And lesser-known consoles like the Zeebo are especially prone to this.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the history of the Zeebo, the South American Homes console. If I eventually manage to load this system with ROM files, expect another video on this bizarre, mostly forgotten platform down the line. But in the meantime, subscribe to my channel and be sure to check out my backlog of content which I've created on all sorts of gaming oddities.
Hey everyone, thank you for watching Magical Drop 3. If you enjoyed Magical Drop 3, be sure to like, comment, subscribe and share this video. All that fun Magical Drop 3. And if you want to support the channel, check out my Magical Drop 3, where you'll find all kinds of awesome rewards. Anyway, I hope you have a great Magical Drop 3. Bye! not uncommon for video game developers or publishers to completely change a game when releasing it on a different region. This can happen because they have to obey that region's laws regarding video games, like Germany having stricter rules regarding violence in video games, for example. Or because the publisher managed to snag a partnership and wants to include it in their game, like for example, James Buster Douglas for the Mega Drive. Or in the case of this video, because they already had the rights to a more popular character. Sega of America, for example, was infamous for changing games to better fit the US market. I'm sure by now, everyone already knows at least a few examples of this, like how Super Turbo Adventure became Decap Attack, or how the storylines in Streets of Rage 3 was altered for its Western release. But Sega of America wasn't the only major Sega distributor to do this. In fact, there was another Sega distributor who arguably meddled and changed games even more than they did. I'm talking about Brazil's official Sega representative, Tectoy. Now, a little disclaimer here. I'm not Brazilian, but I do speak the language. I am Portuguese after all. So, it's easier for me to research this subject than any non-Portuguese speaker. So today, we're gonna take a look at their most famous example of sprite changes, and that is turning Wonderboy 2, The Dragon's Trap, into Turma da Mônica no Castelo do Dragão. Was that too fast for you? Okay, let's take it slow. Turma da Mônica no Castelo do Dragão, or in English, Monica's class in the Dragon's Castle. I'm fairly certain everyone already knows about this sprite change though, as I've seen it mentioned on several retro gaming YouTube channels including Guru Larry. Long story short, they changed the generic main character with that of Monica. But what I haven't seen anyone discuss is, who is Monica? Why the change? Where exactly is Monica from? You see, Turma da Mônica was incredibly popular in Brazil. Actually, I'm pretty sure it's still popular over there. It's a comedic comic book series about a classroom of kids and their misadventures. The comic book has been around since the late 50s and it still has new issues to this day. There's even a spin-off aimed at a teenage demographic with a vastly different art style. Damn! Puberty hit Monica like a truck. The comic book was also pretty popular in my home country of Portugal. I used to read it as a kid, and so did a lot of my friends. Though, I honestly have no idea if kids in my country still read it today. I mean, I still see new issues being sold here and there, but that's about it. Despite this series being called Monica's Class, I'm fairly certain the main character is actually called Cebolinha, or at least, that's how I remember it. It's been some 20 years since I've read the comic books. Cebolinha, or Little Onion in English, has a speech impediment and is called Little Onion because of his hair. Then you have Monica, a super strong girl who harbors a crush for Cebolinha and is overly attached to her bunny plushie, often wielding it as a weapon. Despite having a crush on Cebolinha, she's often teased by him because she's bucktooth, which promptly ends up with her kicking the crap out of him. She doesn't stop with him though, she'll kick the crap out of anyone who gets on her bad side. Hell, she's canonically stronger than Superman. Then you have Cascão, a young boy who never bathes and is Cebolinha's best friend. You also have Magali, a young girl with an eating disorder who harbors a crush for Cascão. This is our main cast, but seeing as how the comic book has been around for over 50 years, you can imagine how large the full cast must be by now. What's interesting is that the sprite change in Wonderboy actually does a good job at staying true to the original comic book, with Monica using her plushie and super strength to take down all sorts of monsters. The issue though is that other than replacing the main character with Monica, not much else was changed. So, even though it was a great game, and a popular one at that, many Brazilian Monica fans wanted to see the rest of the cast in the game. Which they did in the Wonderboy sequel, The Dragon's Trap, which received the same treatment as its predecessor, and was released in Brazil under the title Turma da Mônica em o Resgate, or Monica's Class in the Rescue. Any Wonderboy or Master System fan will tell you that Wonderboy 3 is often considered as the best game in the series. So when you couple that with a more complete implementation into the Monica lore, the game became yet another hit for Tectoy. Taking place right after the first game, Monica managed to defeat the evil dragon, but was then kidnapped by Capitão Feio, or in English, Captain Ugly, and it's now up to his friends to save her. In the original version of Wonderboy 3 The Dragon's Trap, Wonderboy could change between animal forms, all of which had their own special ability, which allowed you to progress through the game. Here, you'll be changing between the several cast members to save her. There was quite a bit of effort put into this conversion to make the characters fit their new roles, such as the dragon being replaced by Chico Bento, the only character in the comic books with a gun, Hawkman being replaced by Angel, the Tiny Mouse Man being replaced by Cebolinha's dog, and this time even Cebolinha himself is playable. The game's manual even comes with a small comic book strip detailing the story, which was a pretty awesome thing to do. Then you have the third game in the Wonderboy series, Wonderboy in Monster World, which was converted to Monica na Terra dos Monstros, or Monica in Monsterland. I wonder if they ran out of titles. This sprite rip is also simpler than its predecessor, as it only changes Monica's sprite, the final boss, and a few other minor changes here and there. This was Monica's first, and as far as I know, only 16-bit outing, and the last game starring the comic book characters. You know, unless you want to include Flash games. But why would you want to? Now, as you probably know, Wonderboy 3 The Dragon's Trap was recently remade for modern consoles, sporting a whole new look. Sadly, Tectoy isn't responsible for publishing the new Wonderboy game in Brazil. So this is the end of Monica and Cebolinha's adventures in the Wonderboy universe. Yes! Modders took it upon themselves to give their Brazilian comrades the Wonderboy game they deserve. And you know what? This mod looks damn good. I have never played it, but from what I can see, it manages to fit the aesthetics of both the comic book and Wonderboy perfectly. Hell, even I had a huge rush of nostalgia while watching this trailer. Not because of Tectoy's release, as in Portugal we received the original unaltered games, but simply because I used to read the comic books as a kid, and watching this is bringing all sorts of memories back. And there you have it, the history of how the Wonderboy series was changed in Brazil, and how it ensured the series became hugely successful in that region. I doubt we'll ever see any major Monica releases ever again, but at least, as we've seen, modders can definitely pick up the slack on that end. Hey everyone, thank you for watching 1st1ka's Retro Corner. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share this video. All that fun social media stuff. And be sure to hit that notification bell icon to know when a new video is out. Anyway, I hope you have a great day. Bye!